Hello, and welcome to our video looking at the rise of totalitarianism in the interwar period. In this video, we'll examine what this looks like for the Soviet Union, Italy, Germany, and Spain as we enter that interwar period between World War I and World War II. First, though, let's pause and talk about some vocabulary here. So, I feel like people often interchange these two words, totalitarianism and authoritarianism, but they're in fact different things. So, authoritarian refers to the structure of government rather than a society. So, you can have an authoritarian government regime, but if they're not including other aspects of civilian life, like the economy, education, art, science, morals of the citizens, then it's not totalitarian. So, to be a totalitarian regime, you have to seek to control pretty much all aspects of your civilians' lives. All right, now that we've established that, let's go ahead and start looking at our first example, which is the Soviet Union. Now, we've already talked about these things a lot more in depth in a previous video, but just to give you a quick reminder, Vladimir Lenin emerges with the new Soviet Union in 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution, and he really solidifies his control by 1923. But unfortunately for him, he dies in 1924, and the person that takes his place is Joseph Stalin. And Stalin is the one that's going to pursue this policy of like subordinating the individual to the party, that Russia first mentality, that, we're the Soviet Union sort of thing. So let's look at what makes Stalin a totalitarian ruler. Well, first, he is going to kind of make the Soviet party the only party in the Soviet Union. He rejects any kind of dissent. Like, you are not allowed to disagree with him in any way, shape, or form. He is the sole interpreter of the law and of industry. So that encompasses that economy aspect of totalitarianism. He gets to decide what companies are going to be doing, what they're going to sell, what they're going to sell it for. Um, he proposes a lot of rapid economic changes. He wants industrialization in Russia. And so that we see that with the 5-year plans that he, implements. He tries to collectivize agriculture. But of course, we know that's not very effective because, the peasants did not like the fact that their land was taken from them. Uh, Other ways he's totalitarian, he has the Great Purges. He kills millions of his own people that he sees as anti-Soviet. So we can see that he's got a lot kind of that adds to that totalitarian name. Next, we're going to go and look at Italy and what makes Mussolini a totalitarian ruler. Now, if you recall, Italy originally was part of these Central Powers and was aligned with Austria Hungary and Germany before the war began. But once the war kind of kicks off, they switch sides and go over to the Allies. So technically, they're on the winning side of this war. But the Treaty of Versailles really does not give them much of anything for their efforts. They don't receive the land that they were promised by France and Great Britain for joining that side. They're left with heavy debts. And remember, they didn't have a lot of money to begin with. They're a pretty new nation at this point, and they didn't have the financial stability that places like Great Britain had before that. They're also going to see rising unemployment that leads to a lot of unrest, particularly in their major cities. And there's one big leader that kind of rises out of this situation, and that's going to be Mussolini. So he leads his fascist party, his National Fascist Party, in a coup d'etat in Rome on March, or sorry, not March, October 1922. It's the March on Rome, is what it's called. But he gets rid of the prime minister. He has the king hand him over that symbolic power, and he takes control as a dictator at this point. And he is really widely popular in Italy. He is saying all the right things to these masses that feel really disenfranchised. He's like, the Treaty of Versailles was garbage. It's not our fault that there's all this unemployment, and there's things that we can do to fix this. And so he's really supported by the military, by businesses, by a lot of liberal and right wing people during this time. And this brings us to a really key point here. What is fascism, and how does that look when you're using it to kind of run a government and a society? So, fascism has some key features about it. So, the first is authoritarian rule. You have to have somebody that rejects democracy. They believe in a strong centralized state led by a powerful leader. And so, in this case, that's Mussolini. It glorifies the nation. That's where we see a rise of nationalism and militarism. So it glorifies the nation, it uses violence to achieve a lot of those political goals, and they really promise to revive some sort of previous glory that used to exist. Now, fascist states are very anti communist. They oppose things like socialism, communism, and liberal democracy. So they think those are kind of agents of chaos. They don't want that. They're going to use a lot of violence and intimidation to control the state. So you attack political opponents, you intimidate the voters, you suppress these organizations that don't ally with you. And they start to create what's called the corporate state. So rather than using capitalism or socialism, Mussolini is going to promote this thing called a corporatist economy, where the government coordinates between employers and workers to serve national goals. Though in practice, it really is something that like promotes bigger businesses because if you control a big business, then it's a lot easier than trying to control a lot of small businesses. So now that we have that established, let's look at the difference between communism and fascism because I feel like students often use those words interchangeably just to mean some sort of like authoritarian or totalitarian regime. And they're in fact very different. So in communism, these are kind of the basic tenets. So usually you exist on some theory of like a history of class struggle where people are very like different levels of rights, abilities, things like that. They identify as nations being arbitrary. The idea is that our united, like, equality of classes should unite the world instead, like the workers' revolution, like the working class should unite. We focus more on that than we do on the idea of a generalized nation. It's a global viewpoint rather than like national. So it's like we all are in this together, not just our nations in this together. And the government is going to run most of the industry, which means that you don't see private ownership of any kind of business. Now, in fascist states, we see a struggle between nations and races. Usually, there is some kind of like racial superiority factor that comes in with fascism. They don't want that kind of generally all united. It's like we'd rather be all united against someone else. They see the nation as kind of central to their movement. So, nations are a source of pride that is emphasized and they view things through a national viewpoint. So like we do things for the good of the nation, not for the good of the class. And then you see that the government does have some control over industry. Things are still privately owned for the most part, but the government does have a lot of say in what happens with those businesses. Now, this really brings us to the leader of kind of the ultimate fascist state, Germany under Adolf Hitler. Now, in between World War I and when Hitler takes power, we have what's called the Weimar Republic. And so the Weimar Republic is that government that's implemented right there at the end of World War I, after the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II. So in this government, they have a democratic constitution, they have a president that's elected by the people, a chancellor that's appointed by the president, and then a large parliament called the Reichstag. And they're elected to represent, the different people, different, communities. So this is established in 1919. And kind of from the get-go, they're going to face a lot of big problems. So they're the ones that are going to have the hyperinflation, the political extremists kind of trying to take over. Remember, Germany's never had any sort of kind of state like this before. They've been led by kings throughout their history. They're saddled with that war reparations debt and just have a lot of instability in their government. And it's the Weimar Republic that's going to see the collapse in the early 1930s. And it's during the Weimar Republic that we see the rise of Adolf Hitler. So Hitler, he's born in Austria, but he lives in Germany. He's a decorated World War I veteran. He fought in some major battles like the Battle of the Somme, and he uses that military service to really appeal to the people and especially to criticize the Treaty of Versailles. And he's going to be the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party. Hitler is actually going to be a big fan of Benito Mussolini over in Italy. He's been watching what Mussolini's been doing, and he really agrees that that's kind of the way to go with the movement that he wants for the Nazi Party. So he tries his own kind of march on Rome, and he declares a new government in a beer hall in Puch, and it doesn't go well. Um, he clashes with police, the march is destroyed, and this is what ends him kind of ending up in prison for attempting this coup on the government. So he's arrested and he uses his trial to gain publicity for his ideas and his movement. He gains a lot of notoriety and popularity, and he just kind of like shouts out about all the things he sees wrong with the German state. He's sentenced to 5 years in prison, but actually only serves about one, maybe a little less than one. And during that time in prison, that's when he writes Mein Kampf, My Struggle, where he basically kind of has his political rant about what he thinks should be happening with the German state. And that's where he names the Jewish people as like the problem to the state. And this book starts to circulate and spread his ideas. At this point, Hitler's out of prison. It's about 1930, and the Great Depression is in full swing. The money from America with the Dawes Plan has officially dried up, and now it's time for a power exchange. They're supposed to be holding elections. And so the president at the time, he runs for reelection, and he's really the only one that could defeat Hitler. He was pretty popular. But what happens is that he has difficulty fending off the Nazi party. Like they're very violent. Appoints Hitler as the chancellor of Germany after he gets, the presidency again. But it's not long after that before Hitler is able to kind of muscle him out of the way. All of this really comes to a head in February of 1933 when the Reichstag, the government building, is set on fire. So they claim that it's a Dutch communist that set the fire and they caught him and then they tried him and he was quickly executed. But a lot of historians really believe that the Nazis themselves kind of staged the fire and kind of blamed it on this person as a reason to basically start these new suspended civil liberties. So things that they're doing, they're suspending things like the free press, assembly, free speech. You can't do any of those things anymore. They're basically kind of declaring martial law. And it's not too long after that Hindenburg dies, the president dies, and Hitler then takes that opportunity to name himself the head of the state, which is the Fuhrer. And part of Hitler's regime, of course, is heavy police and military involvement for that suppression and violence factor that Mussolini also employs as a fascist state. So you see the rise of stormtroopers, the SS and the SA. You see the Gestapo, the official military secret police. So it becomes a very strict, controlled state very quickly once Hitler takes power. Okay, for our final place we'll talk about today, we're going to talk about some place we haven't talked about in a while, Spain. Spain, up until this point, had been going through kind of a rough time. Now, they had been ruled by a monarchy that was like a monarchy and military that dominated, basically a dictatorship. And a lot of Spaniards really want reform, but nobody can really agree on like what that reform should look like. So you've got your progressive reforms. There's people that want things like land redistribution and the separation of church and state, and women's suffrage, and the power of the military reduced. But the conservative group doesn't like this. And then the radicals don't think that that's enough. And so it leads to this really weakened trust in their new government system. And so we see a rise in nationalists that are led by military forces starting to gain and assert more of their power. And it all really culminates in a civil war in Spain in the 1930s, where Francisco Franco he tries to launch a coup against this republic, and it fails and leads to that civil war. And the outcome, with help from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, is that Franco's nationalist forces will win out. And so Franco institutes this government that's going to last until 1975, ruling as kind of a fascist state in Spain. And the things that he's going to emphasize throughout this whole thing is Spanish nationalism, maintaining territorial integrity, like not giving up more land, very Catholicism centered, anti communist, and an emphasis on more traditional values, which again is very common in a fascist state. We are going to talk a little bit more about this in a different video, but that's really kind of what you need to know for now about Spain and the rise of fascism there. And that really concludes our video for today. Thanks for watching.